General Physics Laboratory Mechanics. The table of contents of this preview is purpose, measurement and errors, one-dimension motion free fall, vectors, two-dimensional motion projectiles, Newton's law of motion, frictional and spring, conservation of energy, conservation of momentum, significant figures, making good graph. The laws of physics are based on experimental and observation facts. Laboratory work is therefore an important part of course in general physics. It helps students to increase their understanding of physics concepts and to develop skills in fundamental scientific measurements. It is useful to experience the difficulties of making quantity measurement in the real world and to learn how to record and process experimental data. The first experiment is measurements and errors. The purpose of this experiment is to practice using several measuring instruments and identifying their error, recording result and doing calculation using the proper significant figures, representing results in table and graphs and extracting useful information. Example, using the slope, identifying the source of errors and estimating the relative error in the result. From this instrument is the Vernier caliper. This is a photo of Vernier caliper. It contains a main fixed scale, a secondary sliding scale as shown in the figure blue. The smallest division on the fixed scale is usually 1 millimeter. The sliding secondary scale used to indicate where the measurement lies when it is in between two of the marks on the main scale. For instance, if you move the sliding scale by a small amount, only one pair of marks will come into alignment. The reading on the sliding scale is found by counting the number of divisions to the alignment and multiplying by the precision of caliper. The precision of caliper can be found by dividing 1 millimeter by the number of the division on the sliding scale. The final reading is determined by adding reading on the sliding scale to reading on the main scale. A micrometer is used for measurements that requires greater precision than caliper. Though micrometers give superior precision, it can only measure very small lengths. It consists of calibrated screw that which when rotates helps in giving an accurate measurement. Experiment one-dimensional motion free fall. The purpose of this experiment is to study the motion of particles with constant acceleration in one dimension. You will study the relation between the displacement and time of free-falling object and check that it is consistent with the equation of motion. Experiment of vectors. The purpose of this experiment is to practice representing force vector graphically and mathematically, decomposing or resolving force vector into components, finding the resultant force vector adding vector graphically and mathematically. The experiment of two-dimensional motion projectiles. The purpose of this experiment is to study the motion of objects moving into two dimensions with the constant acceleration, for which projectile motion provides an excellent example. Students will practice how equations of motion are applied in this case, and how the different variables of motion are related. For example, students will predict the horizontal range of projectile shoot from various heights and angles, and will study the time of flight of projectile shot horizontally and different muzzle velocity. Experimental Newton's laws of motion. In this experiment, Newton's first and third law will be studied. The purpose of this part is to determine how external force influence an object's motion by analyzing the velocity of number of objects. The purpose of the second part is to determine the relation between the force acting on interacting object. In this part, the force sensors are used to measure the paired force in a rubber band tug war and the paired force in collision of two cars. The experiment of frictional and spring force. The purpose of this experiment is to find the coefficient of static friction and the coefficient kinetic friction for different surfaces, to find the spring constant for several springs. The experiment conservation of energy. The purpose of this experiment is to observe the potential and kinetic energies for the roller coaster and to investigate the conservation of mechanical energy for this system. Experiment of conservation of momentum. The purpose of this experiment is to investigate the conservation of momentum and kinetic energy of a system in collisions and explosions.